Welcome to another episode of B-Movie Enema, the series. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, your best-dressed horror host in all the land. Now that over there is Nurse Disembody, but what's your problem over there?
You said the best-dressed horror host?
Well, sure, why not?
Okay, well, I can think of at least, everything that's wrong with that statement. First of all, you're not a horror host. Second, are you really a host? Yeah, you pretty much just abandoned any semblance that you are a doctor or what? Yeah, those are just t-shirts.
Well, I don't know, I think these give me character.
Sure, whatever, those aren't even real glasses. Speaking of character... Exactly. Not only do you just wear t-shirts and dumped the whole Scrubs thing and what have you, you don't do a voice or makeup or... I mean, you take a look at some of the other guys out there, you probably need to up your game, Enema Man.
Seriously, where'd all that come from? Just
setting the record straight.
What record?
You come in here saying you're the best-dressed horror host in all the land. I figured...
Yeah.
You could probably use a shave.
Well, I do shave around the spots of my neck and face where I don't want my beard.
I'm talking about your ass. You're like a Sasquatch.
Okay. Anything else?
You could probably cut back on the garlic in your food. Maybe consider a different deodorant. Just because you can wear long sleeves, that doesn't mean you have to use them as Kleenexes. Oh, and don't get me started on the hair you leave in the shower. Have you ever considered that maybe you should wash your hands each and every time you use the bathroom?
All right. Just give me the fucking movie. All right. Now, this week, we have ourselves a Spanish-Italian co-production called The Fourth Victim. Now, this comes from director Eugenio Martin. Now, Martin's career began in 1955 when he wrote and directed a few shorts. Now, his first feature was in 1961 with Conqueror of Maracaibo. Now, I could go on and on listing off his movies, but it would probably be quickly deduced that there aren't that many movies that you'll likely know. Martin was Spanish, which means pretty much all of his career was spent in Europe making international films that were often co-productions between Spain and other European countries. That said, there are a couple of notable films on his resume. The first is the spaghetti western he made in 1966 called The Bounty Killer. It was released here in the United States as The Ugly Ones. Now, he made several westerns, but The Bounty Killer was by far his most popular. And during the credits of Quentin Tarantino's 2012 film Django, the song that plays during the credits is called Ode to Django. Now, in that song, lines from The Bounty Killer are sampled into the composition. However, I think his much more popular and beloved film is 1972's Horror Express. Now, that opportunity came when he caught the eye of American producer Philip Yordan. Now, with Yordan, Martin made 3 films: Bad Man's River, Horror Express, and Pancho Villa. Those 3 happen to be the 3 movies that immediately followed The Fourth Victim. So when it comes to Horror Express, that starred the marvelous Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing. Both of them basically play sort of good guys, at least they're the protagonists. That's a movie that makes me think of the type of claustrophobic types of horrors like Alien. In Horror Express, you have a monster on a train that is basically not going to stop And that monster has a whole lot of captive targets to terrorize. I mean, it's a pretty good flick. I would highly recommend it if you haven't seen it. And if you have seen it, hey, watch it again. Alright, so let's get this movie started. We'll be back after the first segment of The Fourth Victim, and we'll talk about our leading lady for the movie, Carol Baker.
Look, I'm sorry. I know sometimes I can get carried away. It's just, I felt it would be better to not lie.
Oh, I hear you.
I think it should be important that we uphold high standards of accuracy and truth for the benefit of our viewers. Especially if we're talking about ourselves. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I don't disagree.
Okay, good. So, not mad at me?
Mad? Whoever said I was mad? I mean, you were only just setting the record straight, right?
Right. So, what you doing over there?
Oh, I'm working on a life insurance policy.
Oh, that's a good way to plan for the future, I suppose. Don't want to worry any loved ones over burial costs, right?
Yeah, no, this one's for you. I'm taking out an insurance policy for you.
Oh.
Alright, so in The Fourth Victim, a wealthy Englishman, Arthur Anderson, has been married 3 times, but he's also thrice widowed. Now, Arthur is played by Michael Craig. Now, Craig had a nearly 70-year career in films and TV. The largest part of his film career came in the 50s and 60s. He was actually groomed to be a leading man for the Rank organization by the end of the 50s, and even earned a BAFTA nomination for Best Actor for the 1958 war film Sea of Sand, in which he co-starred with Richard Attenborough. But Craig mostly worked in British and European films. The contract with Rank was intended to make him a major international star, and that turned out to be somewhat true, as he had consistent work in film roles between the early 50s all the way through to the late 70s. Now, the 70s did cool his film career a little bit as he began working more on television, but again, between 1953 and 1995, he worked relatively regularly, but there are a couple of roles that I do know him from. In film, he did make a couple of Australian films, and one of those was 1982's Turkey Shoot, directed by Brian Trenchard Smith. He plays Charles Thatcher, who was the evil warden of Camp 47 and supervised the Most Dangerous Game style Turkey Shoot. Now, allow me to slip on a tinfoil hat, because I can't help but to notice that his name is kind of a combination of Prince, now King, Charles, and Margaret Thatcher. Considering this is a movie that seems to have something to say about an upper-class society trying to squash dissident voices, the world is portrayed as an ultra-conservative and somewhat dystopian society, and the government imprisons political enemies for use in the titular Turkey Shoot. In a world that was leaning heavily into more conservative values in Britain with Thatcher, and in the States with Ronald Reagan, I have to assume there was some intentional commentary there. But anyway, I definitely give Turkey Shoot a thumbs up. I wrote about it some time ago on the B-Movie Enema blog. But on television, there is a role I definitely recognize.
Let me guess. Star Trek?
Now, typically, you'd think that's where I'm headed, but no, he's a Brit. So when it comes to British actors and television opportunities, was as a guest star in a Doctor Who serial. And in the waning years of the series' original run, he did appear in the 1986 serial, colloquially known as Terror of the Vervoids, which was the 3rd serial in the 23rd season, which was collectively titled The Trial of a Time Lord, which would be the final season of 6th Doctor Colin Baker's run. However, there is another Baker here that we do need to talk about. See what I did there, nurse?
Very nice transition, Jeff. Maybe you do have a future in this movie hosting business.
Gosh, I need to make sure that insurance policy went through. But anyway, at the very end of that first segment, Arthur discovers there is someone swimming in his pool. This person, we will soon find out, is something of an admirer. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about what's really kind of going on with Arthur in this movie a little bit later, but that bathing beauty is the American actress Carol Baker. And at the time that this was released, Baker was about to turn 40, and she was still securing sexy and attractive lady roles. Now, Baker came from West Central Pennsylvania, and growing up, she became interested in marching band, musicals, and she was on her high school debate team. And in her early 20s, she started up acting lessons under famed acting teacher Lee Strasberg. Now, get this. Her classmates are a who's who of big-time film people. She studied with director Mike Nichols and actors Rod Steiger, Shelley Winters, both of whom became Oscar winners, Marilyn Monroe, and her best friend in the class was none other than James Dean. And it wasn't long before she began appearing on TV on the show Monodrama Theater, which was a showcase for one-person dramas. That friend of hers, James Dean, suggested her to play the lead in Rebel Without a Cause in 1955, but she, in perhaps one of the biggest bungles ever, turned down the role. But 1 year later, she did not turn down a supporting role in James Dean's final film, Giant. That was her first major screen role, and despite having been offered a lot of leading lady roles, and she definitely had the looks to be a leading lady, she kind of suffered from insecurity and a little bit of what I think we'd call imposter syndrome, and wanted to kind of stick to lesser profile roles as she was getting started. But despite the efforts to avoid too much limelight, she got the lead in Elia Kazan's Baby Doll, which was meant to star Marilyn Monroe. However, Baker got it because writer Tennessee Williams was so impressed by her performance of a scene from his script at the Actors Studio. Kazan saw her on Broadway at a point too, and thought that maybe she would be better for Baby Doll. Baby Doll established Baker as a sex symbol, leading lady, and a potential A-list star. It also earned her an Oscar nomination for Best Actress. Also, she shared the Best Newcomer Award at the Golden Globes with Jane Mansfield and Natalie Wood.
Seems like every name you mention alongside hers is a big-time person.
Oh, absolutely. Carol Baker would not be someone who would be quite as remembered as those other names, but she certainly had a lot of fame for a period of time, and certainly knew a lot of folks. As Baker's career went into the 60s, she was every bit the sex symbol as anyone else at the time, and that led to her posing in Playboy in 1964 and then being cast in a bunch of potboilers. You know what a potboiler is, nurse?
No, but I'm sure you'll either tell me or that's how you're going to cash in on that insurance policy you took out on me.
A potboiler is basically another term for an easy paycheck for an artist. If you're a novelist, instead of trying to write the next great American novel, you might write a pulp novel. If you're a filmmaker or an actor, you're making a movie that doesn't ask that much from you. I would say it's a tier kind of either below or right around what we would call exploitation films. But look at it like this. Liam Neeson makes Taken, which I would argue is more of an exploitation action film that's basically there to showcase him being a badass and doing badass action shit, right?
I'm with ya.
Okay, but now, some years later, he makes the movie Retribution, which is basically a knockoff of Taken. And I'd argue that someone put together Retribution to sell it quick and easy, and Neeson is paid somewhat well to basically show up and do typical Liam Neeson things without breaking much of a sweat. Retribution probably could be very easily called a potboiler. But anyway, back to Carol Baker. She was making a lot of these movies where she was paid to come in, be a sexy woman of dubious repute, and when her highly publicized turn as Jean Harlow more or less flopped, she soured on Joseph Levine, who was basically the guy who sold Baker to Paramount Pictures, and kind of sued him over her contract with Paramount and how she was being handled. Now that essentially blacklisted her and effectively ended her leading lady status in films, at least in the United States. So she went to Italy, and we'll talk a bit more about that after we watch this next segment of The Fourth Victim.
I don't know about you, Jeff. I feel like it wouldn't be the best idea to start immediately courting a man who has recently been on trial for killing his wives.
Hey man, that's Italian exploitation film for you. But let's talk about what's going on in The Fourth Victim, because I do think this is a pretty intriguing little movie. And as I mentioned, Michael Craig is playing Arthur, and the movie opens with Arthur's third wife literally dying. She's taken an overdose of pills to kill herself. Now, generally speaking, even if it is his third wife who has passed away, even with pills or whatever, in whichever way that she chose to kill herself, I don't think you'd automatically think Arthur would be in all that much trouble, right?
Sounds about right. I should know.
Now, but the issue... Wait, for real?
I had a life before working here.
Huh. Okay, anyway, if you have one wife who dies because she's depressed, that's not that big of a deal. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, right? I mean, it's not even that big of a deal to collect on life insurance or mention your marriage has soured. But this was his third wife who expired from unusual circumstances. His first wife was driving Arthur's car, which had faulty brakes, and wrecked, and she died. The second wife died while visiting Arthur at a construction site, which led to her falling from a building to her death. So you've been married 3 times and widowed 3 times, right? Not a great look. Each one of his wives carried a life insurance policy greater than the one prior. The first wife had a £5,000 policy, the second had a £40,000 policy, and his third had a policy worth £120,000. So when you get married 3 times and you've tragically lost all 3 wives due to unnatural causes, and you've cashed out £165,000 worth of life insurance policies, you might be a little suspect.
Yeah, I mean, how could Arthur not be very suspicious? I get if you had a wife who has an unexpected heart attack and dies, then you have another wife who might have one of those accidental deaths, then a third wife also, has butt cancer or something. That's just unlucky. When you have a suicide and 2 other accidental deaths, that seems pretty suspicious to me.
Yeah, and I also think it's fairly damning that Arthur admits that he and his third wife no longer loved one another. Their marriage had completely fallen apart. But what really kind of makes me laugh a little bit is how his housekeeper, Felicity, takes the stand and basically says that she was more to blame for the wife's death than Arthur. She knew the wife was suicidal and threatening to kill herself, and Felicity told the wife that she was going to tell Arthur, which then pushed her over the edge. And you know what? It works! Arthur is let off and more or less cleared of the charges of murder, or at least somewhat, or some sort of negligence, right? But then the cop follows him, but the inspector is kind of doofy and only follows just in case, I guess, Arthur is a serial killer and can't help but to kill somebody on his way home from his own trial, but he's not really able to do anything to him. It's wild, but it's also so very Italian in these genre films.
I don't know, I'm starting to get a little bit of a bad vibe from that housekeeper.
Yeah, I do too, but you know who I don't get a bad vibe from? Carol Baker. So let's get back to her story.
Ooh, yes please.
Alright, so previously I mentioned how Carol Baker got basically blacklisted from Hollywood after a very public falling out with Joseph Levine, who was basically attempting to prop her up as a major star in the 60s, but she was getting less than stellar movies to star in. Now, because she was blacklisted and she had 2 kids at the time, she needed to find where the work was, and this led her to where her star would really rise, if you ask me. Sure, she was in big movies and got an Oscar nomination, but when she went to Europe to find work, Italy would make her a genre superstar. Her work in Italian films began in 1967 with the comedy drama Her Harem. And for the next about decade and a half, Baker worked quite often in European films, but mostly Italian films. So from 1969 to 1972, Baker worked with Umberto Lenzi on 4 classic giallo films. This started with Paranoia, then So Sweet, So Perverse, both of which were in 1969, then 1970's A Quiet Place to Kill, and finally 1972's Knife of Ice. These are considered absolute classics in Italian genre films and make her a massive cult figure in giallo. For basically the rest of the 70s, Baker would be a major draw to European audiences, and this included 1973's Baba Yaga, where she played the titular Slavic folklore figure. Now, the original Slavic figure is usually depicted as an old, kind of ugly woman, and sometimes she eats children and is evil, but in other cases she might be an ally of a hero of the story. However, in the 1973 movie, it's portrayed very differently. For one, Carol Baker is not that old at that time, and two, not that ugly, so it's a lot more of a seductive take on the lore and kind of reminiscent of the beautiful erotic horror film Daughters of Darkness, but I digress.
Ooh, can we watch the sexy witch movie?
Maybe? I don't know. Anyway, by the end of the 70s, she was on her way back to American films, and she would come back in a fairly big way. First, she appeared in Andy Warhol's Bad, and just a few years after that, she got cast in Disney's Watcher in the Woods alongside the great Bette Davis. And shortly after that, she appears in Bob Fosse's Star 80 about the tragically murdered playmate Dorothy Stratton. As the 80s continued on, she then appeared as Jack Nicholson's estranged wife in Ironweed, and that might have very nearly scored her a second Oscar nomination, but she fell just short of making the list. In 1990, she played a villain in the Arnold Schwarzenegger smash hit Kindergarten Cop, and she continued to work throughout the rest of the 90s, but the movies weren't, of course, quite as big as Kindergarten Cop. Now, she did get a bit part in David Fincher's Italian genre pastiche, The Game, in 1997. And Carol Baker ended up having a pretty decent career. I mean, she very nearly lost everything, fighting back against what she felt was being kind of her career being mishandled by Joseph Levine, but found where the work was and started to really knock it out of the park. The Fourth Victim comes right smack dab in the middle of her meteoric rise thanks to her work in Italian films. It's a fantastic turn she was able to make it all work, and she's truly a fantastic piece of these Italian thrillers. But you know one interesting recurring theme that ends up happening throughout her career?
I'm not sure.
Now, if you go to her Wikipedia page, you will find time and again commentary provided by Roger Ebert. Ebert had to have been something of a fan of hers.
Maybe he had a little crush on her.
Oh, Ebert definitely liked the ladies, but he constantly commented on the quality of her roles and her performances. While still giving a negative review for Paranoia, he still states that she might have just been saying, what the hell, and then decided to just have fun with the part. With 1986's Native Son, he praised her for having this really powerful performance that she shared with Oprah Winfrey in the film's final scenes. He thought she was so good in Ironweed because she elevated her talents and held her own against one of the greatest actors in film history, Jack Nicholson. But my favorite quote from him in her Wikipedia page is his comment about her in Kindergarten Cop, where he called her an effective bitch on wheels. That's just great.
Ooh, I can only hope to someday be an effective bitch on wheels.
Hey, definitely something to aspire to. But still, Carol Baker is so good in this movie and in everything I've ever seen her in. While she does kind of suspiciously show up in this movie, she is so likable. You know, how can you not want to kind of basically keep being around her and be drawn to her like Arthur is? But let's get back to The Fourth Victim, because boy, do we have a final act for you. I mean, after all, we must always remember that we are, indeed, watching an Italian thriller.
Wait.
What you got over there, nurse?
So the real killer just drowns herself?
Uh-huh.
Gosh, I guess that was kind of convenient.
Sure is.
Also, was that really all the movie there was?
What do you mean?
Where's the scene that revealed the housekeeper was really the mastermind behind all the crimes and murders? I refuse to believe she was not the real killer of Arthur's wives.
Well, she might have been. I guess we really don't know. That's the thing about The Fourth Victim. It's a classic Italian thriller in the sense that if you think just a little bit about what you're seeing and what the actual plot is, you're going to really be disappointed that none of it really connects like it should.
I still think there's a missing scene for the housekeeper to be found out as the killer of those wives.
It's the reveal in the third act that gets a little weird. Yes, when Arthur tries to figure out more about who this new woman is in his life, the woman played by Carol Baker, he does learn a few things. First, this Julie Spencer lady does not own the Dracula house across the lake. It's only being rented, and Julie is actually living in a tent inside that house. Second, Julie Spencer seems to be very interested in Arthur based on what she's seen in newspapers. Thirdly, and maybe most importantly, Julie Spencer was once committed for murdering a husband. Now, what we do end up finding out is that Julie is not the real Julie. In fact, she is Lillian Martin, and she is the sister of Arthur's third wife, and she's trying to figure out what she can about the death of her sister. It's kind of odd that her brother-in-law is now thrice widowed, and she wants to know if he's more involved with her death than what the courts could conclusively prove.
She should be investigating the housekeeper, but what do I know?
Yeah, the real Julie Spencer is in fact a crazy person and murderess. She intends on killing Lillian by drowning her in a lake that she herself was terrified of, only to accidentally tie herself to her anchor and then drown herself. Gosh, she was so insane that she tried to project her own fears onto the woman impersonating her and ends up creating a self-fulfilling prophecy that kills herself. My brain is broken. Nurse, give us your final thoughts.
This movie sure is something else, isn't it? I will say I think this movie is interesting. I liked Michael Craig and Carol Baker, and I did find myself interested in the whole mystery, even if I still to this day believe the housekeeper was killing wives. It is kind of funny that everyone in a position of authority seemed pretty naive. They have more than enough reason to think Arthur is a killer based solely on circumstantial evidence, but someone says he didn't do it? Okay, I guess he didn't do it. The big climax is hilariously convenient that we get introduced to the real killer in the final act, only for her to kill herself. Generally, I liked the vibe of this movie. I'm giving it a solid 4 poops out of 5. It could have gotten a 5, but I had to dock a poop for cutting out the scene that proved the housekeeper was a killer.
Fair enough. I didn't talk about Inspector Dunphy. He is the guy who's consistently tailing Arthur after the courts couldn't convict him for the death of his third wife. He was played by Jose Luis Lopez Vasquez. He was a Spanish actor who's considered one of the great Spanish actors. He had a TV and film career that spanned 60 years. He worked well into his 80s. He was also a major star in theater as well. Over the years, after his death, biographies were written and documentaries were made that were either specifically about him or featured him as a part of a generation of great Spanish actors that has been said there has never really been a replacement for once they all passed away. He's been the subject of artwork and other tributes, and I would suspect that he is a major influence on Spanish actors to this day. In fact, this year there was an exhibition that featured artwork that he himself collected. Now, if you go through his Wikipedia page, it's a very extensive history of a guy who is largely kind of unknown in the US and Canada. It lists all the different awards he won in his career. In fact, he very rarely got nominated for an award he would not ultimately win. Now, Felicity, the housekeeper that I think my nurse is unfairly fingering as a murderer,
She did it!
She's played by Miranda Campa. Now, Campa was an Italian actress born in Switzerland. She came from a family of actors and studied acting in Rome and was best known for being a stage actress. But over the course of 35 years, she racked up over 80 credits in TV and film. She did a lot of voice acting as well for dubbing movies into Italian. all this is to say that The Fourth Victim, while kind of obscure today, is kind of featured a pretty stellar international cast for the 4 main roles. Well, I think it's time to put this week's episode to bed. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, and that was Nurse Disembodied. Wait, Nurse? What are you doing over there?
I was checking out some Airbnb listings for houses on this lake that always terrified me back before, I ultimately went crazy.
That's fun, I guess.
Ooh, also check out this deal for a really heavy anchor I just scored on Amazon. Get packed up, we've got a fun weekend ahead.